start recording. Yeah. So I'm talking about transaction propagation not supported. Okay. And here you see this is similar to never, but never is more restricted. It has got more restriction. So it will throw exception if you try to call a method, call this method, which is annotated as propagation never. You try to call that method from transaction context, it will throw an exception, right? It will throw an exception. So now, you know what? Here we'll see not supported. So what exactly this not supported does? So this not supported here, transaction behavior, not supported, you will find that this method you'll find that it will make sure that whenever you try to call this method under the transaction context, you see the method, the transaction, from which this method is called, the method from which, the transaction context from which this method is called, the transaction will be suspended. Okay, if you got any transaction, that particular transaction will be suspended till this method finishes execution. The transaction context will be suspended till this method finishes execution. Yes. So here it won't throw any exception, but you see, for suppose I got a method. Let's say we are calling this method from another method. Let's say add product method. You're calling it from another method. What is that method? Let's say some process method. So in this method, you're calling add product. So in that case, let's assume that there can be two possibilities. What are they? First of all, this method, it might be executing, or this method, let's say for this method, the transaction advice is applied. Assume that for this method already, the transaction advice is applied. It means this process method is already executing under the transaction context. Assume that the process method is already executing under the transaction context. So if that is the case, what happens? That is the case, then what happens? You see, you will find that here if you are calling this add product method, okay, the process method is already executing from a transaction context, right? Process method is already executing from a transaction context. Yes. And if you call the process method, okay, if you call the add product method from the process method, you call the add product method from the process method, then in that case, see, you will find that the transaction with context in which this process method is executing, transaction context in which the process method is executing, that transaction context will be suspended till add product method finishes execution. Okay, the transaction context will be suspended till the add method finishes execution. Yes. Here, that means whenever you don't want a method to execute under the transaction context, okay, and if any method is called, method is calling this method, okay, which is, if that method is running from a transaction context already, you see here, we don't want to disturb the transaction context, okay, which is already applied for that particular method. Then you can use this method called as, then you can use this propagation called as transaction, propagation call as not supported. Okay, you can use this propagation call as not supported. Okay, yes. So here, you see, you'll find that generally you can use this transaction propagation for which method? Can you people tell me? You got few methods here in the DO, right? So which method we can apply this not supported? Add product. Can we apply it to the add product here? Actually, I've applied it. Can we apply it to the add product here? This kind of propagation, can we apply it to the add product? Can we apply it to the add product? Okay, can we do that? Yes. No, we cannot apply it because for add product always it's an insert operation basically which needs a transaction context, right? Always we need a transaction context actually. So we cannot apply it for the add product, but we can apply it for other methods. For which method we can apply it? For the get product ID. Because that method need not execute under the transaction context, right? Yes. For that method you can apply it. Yes. You can do that. Yeah. Hope you people got it. Fine. So next we got supported. Supports. I'm sorry. We got something called as supports. Supports here, you'll find that this method, if you apply this transaction advice, you'll find that this method, it executes. If you apply this advice, then it gets that this method may or If you want, you may execute this method under the transaction context, or it may or may not execute. It's your wish. Okay, not your wish in the sense, it is optional, I can say, for this method. Now I can say that the transaction context is optional for this method. The transaction context is optional for this method. Okay, yes, that means, here this method can execute if the transaction context is existing, or this method may also execute even though the transaction context is not existing. Okay, if you call this method from the transaction context, well and good, it will execute without any issues, even without any transaction context. Okay, still if you try to execute this method, still it will work. There won't be any problems. Yeah. So here, this is optional. So that means whenever you want to make sure that for a particular method, the transaction, you want to make it optional, then you can use the supports. Yes. So here it is not mandatory now. So probably for this method, you see, we can use app supports, right? Sometimes this method may be invoked from a transaction context. In that case, okay, here it may execute under the transaction context without any problem. Even though if this method is not invoked from a transaction context, still it can work, not a problem, because transaction is not mandatory here for this method, which method get product by ID. But what should be the transaction propagation for this method, for the add product? Yesterday we were talking about it. There is a transaction propagation which will make sure that the advice is mandatory. What is it? No. Required, that's right. Okay, yes. Now, you know what, here, what if I want a new transaction context to be created every time what if I want a new transaction context to be created okay whenever a particular method executes, for that method always, let's say, a new transaction context should be created. For that method, I want a new transaction context to be created. Okay, yes. Then what to do? So we got an option for that. What you can do is here for that you can use requires new requires new. So what it does basically requires new it actually creates a new context, transaction context every time. It creates a new transaction context each time. Okay, yes. Whenever this method is supposed to be executed, here the transaction manager will make sure that a new transaction is created and this method will execute under the transaction context. Let's say, what if there is already a transaction context available? Let's say, process method is there, it is calling add product method. Let's say process method is already executing under the transaction context. Okay, process method is already executing under the transaction context. Okay, then in that case, what happens to the transaction context? The transaction context again will be temporarily suspended till, okay, the transaction context which is associated to the process method will be temporarily suspended till this add product method executes. Okay, till the add product method executes, the transaction context will be temporarily suspended here. Yes, got it. Here, the add product method will execute under the new transaction context now. Yes. So this propagation behavior is also available. Yes. Fine. This way you'll find that you got different propagation behaviors which we can configure. Now, okay, we saw transaction attributes like timeout and propagation. There is one more transaction attribute called as isolation. Yes. So is anyone familiar with isolation levels or isolation issues? Have you people heard about it? Actually, they are purely related to the database server. Okay. Transactions. Generally, we can set the isolation levels at the database level itself, not here. But okay, we can configure them. For connection basis, those isolation levels will be set on the database server. So, what are isolation levels or isolation issues? Levels are different and issues are different. Is anyone familiar with isolation levels or isolation issues? Okay, there is a one popular isolation issue which you might have heard about it. Dirty read. Have you people heard about it? Dirty read. Dirty read. What is dirty read? Very good. Reading uncommitted transaction. So you will find that okay, I will talk about it in detail, yes, but you know it is somehow related to the transactions, yes. So this way, this is actually one of the isolation issue. Dirty read is one of the isolation issue. Okay, yes. So you know what here, there are four such isolation issues. There are actually four such isolation issues. You know, you'll find that one first issue, isolation issue, is lost update. Two is dirty read. What else? Area, repeatable read, unrepeatable read, and last one is phantom read. So these are the four isolation issues. Okay. Yep. So here, what is lost update issue? Is anyone familiar with lost update? What is lost update? Lost update. You know, here, let's say you got two transactions. Okay, you got two transactions. Transaction A and transaction B. Let's say both the transactions are operating on the same both the transactions are operating on the same data set or row. Okay, yes. You will find that let's say the first transaction here has performed a DB operation. The first transaction is performed a DB operation, a database operation. What is it? Let's say the transaction A has performed an update, and then you see on the same data set, D, let's say the transaction B has also performed an update. But after the transaction A has done that, let's say transaction B has done that. It was also performed an update. Now, here, let's say transaction A, what it did is, it rolled back the transaction. After that transaction B, it wants to commit the transaction. Okay, though there are two independent transactions, but because they're working on the same data set, we'll have some issues. We'll see. Okay, if this is the case, can you people tell me what will be the issues here? What will be the issue here? This is the case. Will there be an issue? Yes. Yes. Actually here, you'll find that definitely there will be an issue. You see, the first transaction, it is updating the record. So the first transaction is updating the record, right? So after the first transaction updates the record, so you see on the same record again, the second transaction is also performing an update, right? It is also performing an update here. Yes. So after that, you see the first transaction, it wants to perform the second transaction is also updating, right? You see here, you'll find that the second transaction's intention was to commit. But you see, before the second transaction's commits the database, okay, performs a commit. You see, this first transaction is rollbacking it. It is actually rollbacking the transaction. That means the changes which are done, the changes which have been done here, by the second transaction as well as the first transaction, what happens? They will not be synced with the database server, right? Yep. So that means the second transaction update is also lost here. The second transaction's update is also lost. So this is the issue. Okay. Yeah. Is it clear for you people? This is the problem. Now the question is how to address this issue. How can we address this issue? Yes. What do you people think? What should be the solution for this? Yeah. Yes. So yes, so transaction A of one of the transactions should lock this data set. So it should actually obtain a write lock, I can say. So write lock means what? If it is a write lock, then you'll find that the other transactions will not on the table. Yeah. You see, the locks can be obtained on the table or on the row also. Okay, they can be obtained on a row. So that means no other transaction will be able to modify. If it obtains a write lock, then what happens? No other transaction will be able to modify this record. Okay, till this transaction completes execution, till this transaction finishes execution, no other transaction will be able to modify this record. So for that, do we need to write any code explicitly to obtain the logs and modify this code and all such things? What do you people think? Do we need to write any code for that on the programming side? Actually, you know what? Here we can set the isolation levels. This is where the isolation levels come into picture. We saw isolation issues, right? So here to address the first issue, isolation issue, on the database side, we can set an isolation level. So what is it? The isolation level is actually, I'll show you here. This is where we can do this. Isolation equal to, sorry, isolation dot read uncommitted. Read uncommitted. This is the isolation level. So what happens if you set the isolation level to read uncommitted? So if you set the isolation level to read uncommitted, then you will find that whichever a writing transaction, a transaction which modifies a record will obtain a write lock, exclusive write lock. Okay, a writing transaction will obtain an exclusive write lock. Okay, and it obtains a shared read lock. It obtains a shared read lock. That means here, if you consider this example, let's say transaction A is updating the record, it will obtain a write lock. Okay, exclusive write lock. That means only this transaction can update this record now. Okay, only this transaction can update this record. Now, what about other transactions which want to read this record? I said this transaction A will obtain a shared read lock. Shared read lock means, what do you people think? Here the name itself indicates shared read lock. That means the other transactions, will they be able to read the record? Will they be able to read this record? Will they be able to read the record? Yes, definitely. Okay. The other transactions, they will be able to read this record. Got it? They will be able to read this record, other transactions. What about writing the record? Will they be able to modify this record? Yes. Will they be able to modify this record? No, they can only read this record, but they cannot modify this record. Okay, yes, they will not be able to modify this record. Yeah, that is what happens. So till what time the other transactions will not be able to write that record? Yes. Till what time the other transactions will not be able to write that record? Till the transaction A finishes execution. Okay. Yes. Either the transaction commits or rollbacks. Till the transaction finishes execution, okay, the other transactions will not be able to modify this record. Got it? So this is, sorry, read uncommitted, not committed, I'm sorry. We have discussed about read uncommitted isolation level now. So here, you know, this isolation level is actually set at the database level. On the database server side, this isolation level will be configured or will be set per connection basis that too. For that particular connection, okay, the isolation level will be set to this read uncommitted. Okay, yes. Now, what about the second issue here, dirty read? You know, dirty read is also very much close to this lost update, but a small change I'll tell you. Let's say here, the second transaction, instead of updating, let's say it is reading this record. Okay, so let's say both the transactions are modifying or operating on the same data set or same record or row. Let's say first transaction is updated the row and the second transaction is reading that update or the changes. But not only reading, that means it is reading that row. That row was updated by transaction A. Okay, the row was updated by transaction A. Okay, yes. You see, in this case, here, the data which is read by this transaction, the data which is read by this transaction, you see, you will find that actually it is uncommitted. The data is uncommitted, right? That means, you know, there is a possibility that whatever the changes this transaction has done, those transactions can be again reverted or rolled back. There is a possibility, but this transaction has read it. And let's say here it is using those changes. Okay, it is making use of those data, the data. Let's say, here, before the transaction A rollbacks, let's say already transaction B has rolled back, let's say, sorry, committed. It was using the data. It is making use of that data. Let's say first transaction B has committed. The transaction has used the data, has updated some other role, let's say, and it has committed. And let's say after that, transaction A rollbacks. After that, transaction A rollbacks. That means what it indicates? What it indicates here? It indicates that transaction B is actually reading the data which is not committed, okay, which is not committed here. So it was using the data which was not appropriate, it was improper data, right? Yes. So this is actually a dirty read. So the transaction B was reading uncommitted data, okay? Yes. This causes dirty read problem. This causes dirty read problem here. Yes. So how to address this issue now? How to address this issue? You got an isolation level called as read committed. You can set the isolation level to read committed. So what happens if you set the isolation level to read committed? That means, a writing transaction will obtain exclusive write lock. A writing transaction will obtain exclusive read lock. Exclusive read lock. Exclusive read lock means this transaction will not allow the other transactions to read the data. Yes, that means you see dirty read problem is addressed because other transactions, they cannot read the data which is modified with this transaction. Uncommitted data, okay, the uncommitted data cannot be read by other transactions here. So this way dirty read problem will be addressed using this isolation level read committed. You see, we can set the isolation level to read committed. If the other part is uncommitted, we can make it committed. That's it. We can set the isolation level to read committed here. Yes. Similarly, we got two more issues. One is unrepeatable read and phantom read. So I'll talk about it tomorrow. Okay. So I'm running out of time. Okay. We'll meet tomorrow again and we'll continue our discussion. You got